Hello everyone, and welcome again to Books in the World, a production of the Cape Cod Writers Center. I'm Madeline Mealy-Holt, and I'm so happy to be here to share with you an exciting story. And our author here, Stephanie Schorow, and I will be talking about the Great Boston Fire, the inferno that nearly incinerated the city. So welcome, Stephanie. I want to tell everyone that Books in the World, and I think I've told you, is a production of the Cape Cod Writers Center that started over 40 years ago. This is probably the oldest continually running book talk show on cable television. So,
Madeline, I'm so glad to be here. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
So you join a long list of authors who either live on the Cape or come to the Cape and shared their expertise and their writing experience with the Cape Cod community, which is why this show was started, to give authors a showcase, authors who wouldn't normally have the opportunity to get this kind of publicity. So
that's great. As an author, I'm very supportive.
Very supportive. So let me tell everyone about the book. For 2 days in November 1872, a massive fire swept through Boston, leaving the downtown in ruins and the population traumatized. Coming barely a year after the infamous Chicago fire, Boston's inferno turned out to be one of the most expensive fires per acre in U.S. history. Yet today, few are aware of how close Boston came to destruction. So Stephanie, she recounts the history from the foolish decisions that precipitated it to the heroics of firefighters who fought it. So we're going to talk about a lot of things, but one of the things I like to bring up is what readers have said, and I'm sure you follow your reader comments. And this one I think is just a lovely read. It says, an absolute must-read for anyone even remotely interested in the Boston Fire Department in general, or the Great Boston Fire in particular. Stephanie Schorow, an extremely gifted wordsmith, takes you on a journey back in time, 150 years, to a time and a story she fashions with taut and vivid prose, all wrapped neatly in her ability to spin a yarn with the best of them. This is Stephanie's best work yet. Well, I'm glad I had an opportunity to find that. Stephanie's best work yet. Well, she was a reporter for Boston Herald, Associated Press, and has some interesting other books. You have 8 books.
8 books out in total,
In total out. I know you're working on things. And we're calling these narrative nonfiction books. And as writers, we like to get into the subject of how books came to be written, and we're going to try to save some time to talk about narrative nonfiction, or as I like to say, nonfiction that reads like fiction. So this definitely does it. But your subjects, the author, some of your other books, Inside the Combat Zone, the stripped-down story of Boston's most notorious neighborhood, Drinking Boston, a history of the city and its spirits, the Boston Mob Guide, Hitmen, Hoodlums, and Hideouts, the Crime of the Century, how the Brinks robbers stole millions and the hearts of Boston. You teach writing at various area colleges, as well as you ghostwrite a blog for MIT professors.
And other places, yes.
Oh, okay, so that's how they get that done.
Yes,
that is how they get that
I'm the
done.
person behind the curtain in the back. Yeah.
Wow. So you live in Medford, but you came to Boston from Chicago, your native Chicago, which could be one of the reasons why you were interested in fires to begin with.
Yes. Grew up with the stories of the Chicago fire
and the rebuilding and all of that. So let's get started. Why did you write this book?
Well, I wrote about this fire in my first book, Boston on Fire, but I was fascinated then, and I just said I want to do a whole book just on this fire. And I think what really intrigued me was, to be quite honest, the scale of the destruction. Looking at the photos of Boston, right, the days after the fire, it's like looking at a nuclear holocaust. It's like looking at a total disaster, and that got me thinking, because this was a place I knew. I been to Downtown Crossing. I've walked those areas countless times. And to think of all that poof, gone in just a couple days really intrigued me. And the more I looked into this fire, the more stories I found I could tell about it. So yes, it is a story of destruction, a big fire, but it's also a story of heroism and bravery in the face of nearly unsurmountable odds. And the fact a lot of people in Boston don't even know what happened. They're not even aware that this went on, where everybody knows the Chicago fire.
Right,
And yet this fire was, in its own way, as terrible because of its huge expense. It wiped out about 776 buildings, about 60 acres. Today, the destruction would be in the $1.6 billion of damage. What it did not do was kill a lot of people for various reasons. And so, fortunately, only about 30 people died, but a very high percentage of firefighters died. About 10 to 11, some were volunteers, died in this fire. And some were burned to death, but some were crushed by buildings that fell down.
Oh, goodness. You know, you mentioned Downtown Crossing, so just describe for a minute the area where the fire took place.
The Downtown Crossing, and we call it that now. I think it was the downtown. It was called the downtown or the commercial district then, and it had been a residential area, and with big stately homes, and very wealthy people would live there. It wasn't Beacon Hill, but it was near there, and then starting a little bit before, and then definitely after the Civil War, it became a commercial area, and houses were torn down and huge buildings for the time were put up there, and they're 5, 6, and 7 stories. Oh my God, they were huge for that time. And so it became a retail section, a warehouse area, a small town factory, a place where goods were traded and brought in and traded and taken out. So it changed character. So it was the heart of the mercantile soul of the city at this time.
You described the fact that the buildings had gone up rather quickly, that they were about 3 or 4 stories high, and they started building them bigger, and then they developed this Mansard Roof situation.
Yes. I mean, the buildings, they weren't just utilitarian. They were meant to be, have some sense of grandeur. They were meant to look like, to celebrate Boston as a captain of industry. So they had granite on them, and many of them had what's called the Mansard Roof on top, which is actually an architectural embellishment. It's kind of a particular kind of rooftop that came from France years before, but in Boston they were made of wood, and they're just kind of an elegant topping on the top of buildings. The trouble was they were very prone to fires, and they were not considered fireproof. And even before the fire, there were many, many warnings of saying that you're putting this great embellishment on there, but you are putting up a fire hazard.
So they knew even then.
They knew even then.
So what caused the fire? Let's just go back. It's 1872. The buildings are packed close to each other. They're filled with goods. You can get into that in a minute. It's a bustling, happy place. People are doing well, I guess.
Yeah. Very prosperous. It was a post-war boom, if you will, economic boom. So they're filled with goods. Everything was getting ready for the Christmas holidays. This is in November. Now, in this particular area, though, it was practically deserted. It was about 7 o'clock at night on a Saturday when the fire broke out. And it broke out in a building. We know where it started. We know it broke out in a building around the corner of Summer and Kingston Street. We know where it broke out. We don't know why it broke out. There is some speculation it broke out in the basement, in the furnace, and somehow caught fire, and then the sparks flew up the chimney, which actually had wood around it, oddly enough, up the chimney to the roof, and the roof caught on fire, and then it spread from roof to roof. But let me say something about that, because I think this is a very important point for this book and other books about fires. How the fire started is not really the crucial issue. Fires started all the time. Boston was extremely prone to fires. Boston, in fact, one author said Boston was built to burn because they had so many fires. But the trouble with this fire is that it spread so uncontrollably and relentlessly from building to building, street to street, jumping blocks, jumping over all kinds of man-made structures, despite the best efforts of the fire department. So it's not just how it started, but why it spread so quickly.
That part of the story is about the fire. A lot of it, and it's fascinating, is about firefighting, and of course about the personalities of the people involved.
Right.
So take it from there. Would you like to talk about?
Sure.
And then the other thing is we want to talk about sort of the cultural history, some of the excitement around it, and the authors who were there, and Louisa May Alcott. So we've got a way to go, and interesting things to talk about.
I'll try to be brief, but I'll talk about John Damerel, who was he was called the chief engineer at the time, but he was the fire chief. And everybody who studies this fire falls in love with this man because he was so interesting, and he was so heroic, self-effacing, and yet very, very stubborn, passionate about firefighting. Firefighting, then as now, was a calling. There were many, the fire department had a mixture of paid firefighters and volunteer. A lot of people fire, or they were on call. They came and they were paid per fire. And Damerel, inspired a lot of confidence from his men, and they're all men at the time, in terms of his knowledge. He was a builder himself, so he knew how these buildings were built. He had been a volunteer firefighter since a very young man. He was elected, there was an elected position to firefighters, so he was one of the most interesting characters in this fire. But he literally ran from his house on Beacon Hill down to where the fire started. And he was right there, and he saw it from the very beginning, and he saw it spread. He had warned this would happen. He was very skilled at knowing techniques for firefighting and knowing ways to prevent them. And he had been warning for years, literally saying, this area, which was residential, is now commercial. You need bigger water mains. The water mains aren't big enough to get enough water. Those Mansard roofs are a hazard. We can't get enough pressure to get to the top of the buildings because the water pressure isn't so great. You know, at this time they were using steam-powered fire engines. So, and there's a whole history on that.
And they were drawn by horses.
And they were drawn by horses.
And the horses were going through an epidemic at the time.
There was a flu that knocked out all the horses, so all the fire engines were being pulled by men. So Damerel had to deal with all this. So he had to watch as the water would run out. They'd be trying to halt it, and the water would literally just peter out. They couldn't do it. The other thing is that there were so many hazards that you wouldn't think about. Granite, for example, has pockets of water, and when that gets heated up, it explodes.
That was fascinating because I was talking about this fire with people who say, oh, well, weren't the buildings granite? I mean, you assume the buildings wouldn't burn the way they did. And I know we have some pictures of the water pressure not being able to get to the tops of the buildings, and we'll be showing those as well. Yeah.
And what's interesting about that, I mean, the brick actually did better than the granite. And so Damerel was faced, and his firefighters, his men, were faced with huge obstacles, not the least of which were the many thousands of people who came to watch the fire. Wow. I mean, fires were a form of entertainment. People came to watch them all the time. It was entertainment maybe is too strong words, but it was fascinating. We all like to watch, we like disaster movies, right? These were disasters that people could come and watch. William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist, he was a bit of a spark. He liked to go to fires. Means someone who liked to look at fires.
Okay.
So he went out. So he went out and looked at the fire. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the poet and physician, he was out there, and Louisa May Alcott, author of Little Women, one of my personal heroines, went out to the fire to watch it and see what was going on. And she has some amazing descriptions of the fire that she wrote to her sister Anna, who we know as Meg from Little Women.
Right. As you use one of her quotes, the red glare, the strange roar, the flying people, all made the night terrible, and it kept thinking of the last days of Pompeii. Yeah.
I mean, the thing is, she was, like many others, were awed by the spectacle of the city burning. I mean, the fire generated so much heat and energy, it created its own wind. It was kind of a hurricane of fire that moved relentlessly through the city. And a lot of people commented on its fierceness and its personality. So many writers and other people call it the Fire Fiend.
Yeah.
That was a word that was used over and over again because this massive fire moved through the city, and Damerel was trying desperately to line up enough men to get enough water. He called for people from all over the New England who came to help fight this fire. And at one point, they thought they had it under control, and then the water ran out, and the fire just swept over them. So they were fighting the fire, then they were pulling back, fighting the fire and pulling back. And it was, the fire started at 7 o'clock on Saturday night, and it went all the way through the night to the next day. At one point, they thought they were going to lose the Old South Meeting House, which is one of the most historic buildings in Boston. But the very last minute, they managed to get water on it, saved by a fire engine. That's what they call an engine. It was brought down by train from New Hampshire called the Kearsarge, which came and helped with fresh men, fresh supplies, and managed to get water and save that building.
Right, and you talk about engines coming from all over the nearby city suburbs and from Connecticut and New Hampshire. So it was a big thing, and then it became a very popular cultural history kind of thing. And there were, first of all, we didn't talk about disaster tourism. That people would come to see the ruins, and we have some great pictures of the ruins, which we'll be showing.
Right.
They look like something out of ancient Rome.
Exactly. I mean, the fire, when it was finally put out by concerted effort of firemen, and went out, they got it under control about Sunday morning. The fire broke out again that evening. So, and then they got it under control. But almost as the ashes were cooling, people came to look because they were watching it when the fire burned, and then they came to see their city in ruins. And so a lot of people flocked to that scene. So did photographers. There are no pictures of the actual fire existing. The technology was not good enough to get the fire as it burned. It was at night, and they just weren't able to do it. But photographers, at least 50 of them, descended on that burnt district, is what they called, and took picture after picture of the ruins. And part of it was to record it, but part of it was commercial, was to sell it. And it's because people like pictures of fire. William Lloyd Garrison got a panorama of the fire from his son, and he was delighted with it. And then other people created another technology that was the amusement of the day. And there's an example of it.
This is called a Stereopticon, and it has pictures here which include the burnt buildings. And when you look through it, you can see the whole scene in 3D. So you won't be able to see this, but as you told me, you can get these on eBay.
Right, and this is, and there's a lot of them. They're countless, and they're very, very, very popular. They got wonderful. Like I said, they look like pictures of Rome, ancient pictures of Rome, and people liked it. You know, when I was first doing my research on this fire, and I saw this, and I think I started to collect some of these pictures, and I thought, this is awful. Why are people wanting to look at pictures of the disaster? And then I realized that this is a common human trait, that we like looking at things being destroyed. If you go to the movies today, everything is being blown up.
Absolutely,
and some of the most famous movies are blowing up the Capitol building. So Independence Day, so that came out when I was first doing my research on that. And so this is a very common, for some reasons humans like to see this scenes of destruction.
Yeah. Well, we've done a bit of a good job, I think, in giving people the idea of what the fire was like and the aftermath. What I wanted you to talk a little bit about is writing these narrative nonfiction that reads like fiction. And I was just going to read a little tiny blurb that illustrates, I think, the idea. And this was about Boston in the 19th century. It was inventive, smug, high-minded, and materialistic. It was a place for shrewd businessmen and ethereal poets. It was a place where civic leaders could not wrap their heads around the possibility that their shining city on a hill was sitting under a tinder box.
Yeah.
Sitting on a tinder box.
Yeah.
So, you know, you could have written that a number of ways, or you could not have even dealt with the fact that there was a kind of personality attributed to Boston and a civic pride. Can you talk a little bit about writing? You do a lot of research, you get all these facts together, and then it's time to spin a yarn, so to speak.
Right, exactly. I think you cannot lose sight of the fact, even when you're writing nonfiction, that you're telling a story. You're trying to engage your readers. You want them to care about what you're writing about. I think a lot of nonfiction writers, especially when you're starting out, can fall in the trap of saying, I've got to get every fact, every material, it's got to be the timeline, it's got to be everything presented as if I was writing a report. Now, accuracy is important, having all those materials is important, but you're trying to get people to come with you on a journey, in this case, back in time and to a particular place. So that requires a lot more research. That paragraph that you read was a result of a lot of research, some of which you won't see cited in the book, but informed the way I wrote the book. I really wanted to get a sense of what Boston was like at the time, because I really felt that it helps to tell the tale of why the fire spread so much. Again, not necessarily how it started, but why it spread, why the city, which had been warned. Damerel went to Chicago, the Chicago fire, and came back and said, hey guys, this could happen here, and he was not believed. And you're thinking, this is the Boston of abolition, you know? This is the Boston of transcendentals. This is where a lot of writers, you know, some of the most famous writers in the country were in the Boston area. Inventors, Alexander Graham Bell, went out and looked at the fire. You know, so he was one of those witnesses. And yet, the hubris that a lot of the city government officials demonstrated, the feeling it can't happen here, it won't happen here, is something that I wanted to stress. And that's what I was trying to do in that paragraph. And definitely, Bostonians were very smug at the time. I've found countless examples of that. And yet, you know, there are a lot of poets. It's interesting. The other thing is and this is about the writing process, places, people, things. Places we've just talked about, people, Damerel. I really wanted to get a sense of what he was like as a person. Now, unfortunately, there's not much of a record there, so I had to sort of use, if you will, my imagination, but an imagination based on fact.
Oh, yeah.
Like his picture. I stared at his picture. I ran from where his house was on Beacon Hill. I said, let me time this. Let me see how fast you can run.
Did.
So I went from his house and I ran. Of course, I had to dodge people, you know, like cars and stuff, which he didn't have to do, and ran all the way to where the Box 52 was, which announced the fire and where the fire was. And because he had said he did it in five minutes or so, and I said, that's impossible. But I ran it and I realized you couldn't. He was carrying an axe in his hat and all that. So I really wanted to get a sense of who he was. And so you extrapolate. The beginning of the book, I get into his head. And you have to do that very, very carefully, because you can, a lot of nonfiction go overboard with that. There's a lot of criticisms of getting too much in a character's head when you don't, or a real
really
person.
don't know.
You really don't know.
Right,
but
right.
I feel like I had researched this, I'd lived with this fire so long, I felt I could to do that. And there's a point to that. It's to get people engaged in your story. And it's not just a series of facts, it's a way you put them together. But I have to emphasize the research, and research for a book like this, you can never do enough research. I mean, and the research is fun. That's what the people say. It was hard to write it. It's fun to research.
You can go on forever.
You just can go on forever, and you can find. It's not all on the internet. Let me warn my young researchers. It's not all on the internet. You have to actually physically go to libraries, to historical societies.
Yes.
God bless them for keeping things going. Libraries, very important.
Yeah,
Library,
we
very
talk about libraries a lot.
Very much,
Yeah.
very much
Yeah.
thing. And eBay.
Okay.
eBay has an amazing
yeah.
amount of stuff
Yeah,
because
yeah.
people are selling things that they don't. Some of them know the value of it, some of them don't. But I was able to get some copies of Harper's Weekly. Some of the illustrations that you'll be showing are from the originals that I got on Harper's Weekly. There's nothing like holding an old newspaper in your hands.
My library, Easton Library, we had complete sets of Harper's Weekly bound.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, I think they're still there.
And you get more stuff then, because if you read the other articles, you know what's happening at the time.
Okay.
You really get a sense, like women's there was a women's magazine that had a little account in the fire, but I went through that magazine this is what women were dressing and doing at the time, and those are the kind of details that you want to infuse your narrative with.
Well, I hate to say, but we are completely out of time.
Okay.
So I think we gave people a lot to think about, and I urge you to get this book. If you're at all interested in Boston history and fires, I found that there's a lot of firefighting. There's a firefighting database. There are societies to which you belong. Buy the book at wherever you buy your books online. Or your local independent bookstore. Go to the library and ask for it. The more people who ask for a book, the more copies the libraries will stock. Librarians are thrilled to respond to people's requests. So come back again. Good luck with your next project, which I know is you have many things in the works and all your endeavors. And we'll see you all again on Books in the World next time. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.
We did it. We did it.
Let me sit down.